Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Dear students, welcome back to our sessions for the subject Business Ethics. Today's topic is about the ethics of consumer production and marketing. So we have different objectives here. The first objective of this or outcomes here for the students to learn is about discussing the concepts of consumer protection. This is actually one of the main principles of this subject, where we have to discuss different theories developed referring to the consumer protection. And also we need to know the different point of view by those manufacturers and factories. Students should also be able to explain the contract theory. We will also talk about different several critics about the contract theory. And then students should be able to understand the due care theory as one of those kind of theories established for the sake of consumer protection. We will also talk about explaining or social cost view, which is another theory developed for that kind of purpose. Students should also be able to discuss several critics about the social cost view. And the last outcome here is evaluating the advertising effects and ethics. So by that, we will cover the following points. The first one is about the consumer protection, and we will talk about the contract theory, due care theory, social cost theory, and we will talk about the advertising ethics. Now we know that consumers today are actually exposed to different kinds of risks simply by the use of these products and sometimes services. So that is why there have been a lot of theories developed to tackle the issue of consumer protection. So here, consumers actually today in today's business are exposed daily to high levels of risk simply by using consumer products. So what kind of risk we may face by using such kind of commodities? Here, the kind of risk we may face in our daily life is actually injuries is one of these examples. So maybe by buying or using one of these products we may face problems that lead to injuries. And there are a lot of examples for products, unsafe products, that cause a lot of injuries. These products can also lead to death. So talking about kind of drugs, chemical substances used in certain products may cause death. Deceptive sale practices is another problem. A promise that is not met by the company is one of these risks, which can cause customers to buy things that cannot actually achieve their needs or wants. Besides, shoddy merchandise that are not safe, are not of high quality, or they do not meet the promise by manufacturers. Finally, unhonored warranties. So these warranties cannot be met, cannot be achieved, although they are actually part of the promotion to these products. Because of these problems, we have something referred to as consumer protection. This is, in nowadays business, becoming part of the law. That is, we have acts referred to as Consumer Protection Acts. So consumers are at great risk every day. In that sense, many believe that consumers are automatically protected from injury because they are part of the free market mechanism or by the operation of the free and competitive market, which means that in a perfectly competitive free markets, we have different alternatives in the market. So if customers find that this product is not safe, they should go to a better choice. That is why we say utility maximizer. But actually, this is not always right in reality. In the market approach to consumer protection, consumer safety is seen as a product, as a good. So that is most efficiently provided through the mechanism of the free market, whereby sellers must respond to consumer demands. And that is why we find companies like Volvo Corporation manufacturing safe cars. And the final price of these cars are actually higher than other brands, implying that customer demand is actually dealing with such kind of we say features, which is safety. However, it is kind of difficult to impose this safety to employees, to customers. So if consumer want produce or products to be safe or safer, they will indicate this preference in markets by willingly paying more for safer products and rejecting unsafe products. In that sense, producer will have to respond to this demand by building more safety into their products. And this is what we refer to as the mechanism of free market. But here, if consumers do not actually place a high value on safety, then it becomes wrong to force them to accept high levels of safety through regulations, simply because they'll go to other options where they're not forced to buy such products with high safety and higher prices. So here we have different theories that can help protect consumers. The first one is referred to as the contract theory. So here, the relationship between a firm and its customers is essentially contractual. Consumers have a right to receive the product they have been promised the way it was actually promised. So based on that, we have the following theory. A contract theory has two kind of duties. The first one is referred to as basic duty, which is more about the use of the product. So the basic duty as to the company is that they have to comply with the terms of the sales contract. So if I buy a pen, for example, then that pen should write well for a durable time accepted. So this is what we mean by a promise here. Besides, we have secondary duties, for example, avoiding the use of duress and undue influence, utilizing the good relation of trust between the buyer and the seller and the buyer to the interest of the seller, avoiding misrepresentation in terms of false information or fake information, and disclosing the nature of the product in terms of ingredients and materials used in the manufacturing process. So by having all these in hand, we can say that the customer is now protected in regard to the contract theory. But the problem here, we have some kind of critics as against this kind of theory. First, manufacturers do not necessarily deal directly with consumers, but they do through advertisements. They deal indirectly through advertisements. Some other times they indirectly deal with customers through channels, like for example retailers and warehouses, sellers. Second, manufacturers can be released from normal contractual obligations by having disclaiming on their products. So when they disclaim that their product is safe and reliable, by this they can be waived from these kind of obligations. And this can be found on products like, for example, tobacco manufacturing industries, where they have some notes clarifying that our products are not safe and they may cause health problem. This kind of disclaim is said, according to critics, can help companies be away or released from normal contractual obligations. Third, buyers and sellers are not equally skilled, and that customers can be easily deceived. And for that reasons and many other reasons, we have the other theory, the due care theory. Now, as the name suggests, it's about caring that should come from the manufacturers to the customers. So the due care theory of the manufacturer's duties to consumer is based on the following ideas. First, consumers and sellers do not meet as equals in terms of information. That is, consumers' interests are particularly vulnerable, has a knowledge and an expertise that the consumer lacks. So, because those manufacturers have better knowledge and expertise about their products, more than what customers have, so it becomes like a duty for these companies to explain the nature of their products. So they have a duty to take special care to ensure that the products they offer are actually safe. The third theory is the social cost view. As the name suggests, this is more about society and the cost that should be embedded or within the final price. Manufacturer must pay the cost of any injuries sustained. And here we're not talking about the cost that goes into the production of the product. Rather, we're talking about the cost of any potential injuries sustained by the use of this product. And that is why we refer to this as social cost. This theory, which forms the basis of the legal doctrine of strict liability as against company, is utilitarian. In that theory or view, external costs of injuries, which are not part of the cost of production, resulting even from unavoidable defects, constitute part of the cost society must pay for producing and using a product. However, a lot of critics here may have different points of view. For example, the major criticism of this theory is that it is unfair because it violates the basic canons of compensatory justice. For example, person should not be forced to compensate an injured party if he or she could not have foreseen and prevented the injury. Besides, it may cause an intended effect of encouraging carelessness in consumers, knowing that if I get injured by the product, someone else will pay for that injuries. And the liability and imposed suits will increase the heavy losses on insurance companies that deal with these companies, forcing insurance rates to rise precipitously and in a way that companies cannot actually deal with. And this can be found in countries where we have surrounding circumstances that cause such kind of insurance rate to go very high in a very dramatic way. For example, companies now selling to Yemen may have to pay more rates, more insurance to companies so that they get these products and commodities to the Yemeni markets. Now, this results in higher prices than usual, which is another problem that can be caused by the application of this theory. Now, another thing affiliating with the use of product is advertising. Commercial advertising is sometimes defined as a form of information, and an advisor is somebody who gives information. And that is here, the implication is that defining function of advertising is to provide information to consumer. Now the question is this information valuable? Does it deserve every penny we pay for this information? What do I get in return for this information? So, in the end, the consumer must cover the cost of advertising. But the question is, what do they get for this extra expenditure? Most consumers say that they get very little. So, is advertising a waste or a benefit? Does it help or harm consumers? And that is why when talking about advertising, we may need to talk about justice, for example, the just price in terms of compensatory justice. If I have to pay something, then I have to get something in return. So the cost of advertising is something that the customer must pay. But what do they get in return is not actually clear. Now we have some kind of effects when we talk about advertising. Another major criticism of advertising here is that it is wasteful. So those who make this type of objection point to the distinction between production cost and selling cost. So the production cost is the kind of cost that go directly into the manufacturing of products, while the selling cost is something that we customers, for example, do not get something in return. It's an extra activities that the company has to do in order to sell their products. So production cost, the cost of the resources consumed in producing a product. While the selling cost, the additional cost of resources that do not go into the product itself. And here comes the ethical dilemma. So the resources consumed by advertising, according to this theory, add nothing to the utility of the product regarding the customers. In that sense, theorists like John Kenneth Galbraith and other critics have long argued that advertising merely manipulates consumers, creating desires solely to absorb industrial output, while on the other hand, these products are of no value to consumers. That is why in nowadays business we hear something called compulsive buying, which is you buy a product or compulsive purchase. You may buy products and then it turns out these products are of no value to you. In that sense, we have two desires: physical desires, such as the desire for food and shelter, which are perfectly normal. But the problem here is with the psychological desires. If we're talking about the manipulation of consumer, then it is more in these kind of desires. Psychological desires that are inspired by the advertising and not under the consumer's control, like those physical desires, which puts the firm instead of the individual in control. And that is why it can go unethical. If Galbraith's view is correct, then advertising violates the individual rights to choose freely for himself or herself. And that is against free rights of individuals and consumer. And accordingly, according our principles of ethics, affiliating with rights. Now by this, dear students, we come to the last points of our sessions. Here we discussed different consumer protection theory. We explained the first one, which is referred to as the contract theory. We discussed the critics about this theory, and then we talked about the due care theory. We explained another kind of theory meant to protect customers, which is referred to as the social cost theory. We discussed several critics about the social cost view. And finally, we evaluated the advertising effects and ethics. You have an attachment here in which you had to address certain questions affiliating with today's topic. Thank you very much for listening. See you inshallah next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.